there, the first of the aircraft that's going to be getting airborne for our opening scenario, taxiing off down the hard taxiway.
Today we talk about, of course we had the largest navy in the world, and we had ultra secret, and we knew what was going on, and all of that kind of thing. At the time, we didn't know all that stuff, did we? We didn't know how likely it was that the Germans would attempt to cross the English Channel, which they could have only done if they had air superiority, which is what the Battle of Britain was all about, denying them the air superiority.
Exactly, and in that is the Hispano HA-1112 M1L Buchon of the Aircraft Restoration Company. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engined version of the Messerschmitt. The filming of the Battle of Britain took place. Spitfire M3200, the only flying aircraft in the Imperial War Museum's collection. To replace some of the Spaniards who went home. And this Buchon was part of the famous cache of these aircraft, which was obtained in part payment for the filming by one of the Confederate Air Force pilots, the legendary Texan aviator Wilson Connie Edwards. Stored on his ranch in Texas for many years. Mercury formation have started and taxied. One exception, unfortunately, is the fighter collection Gladiator. Just waiting to see if that gets underway. But here comes N3200, the IWM Spitfire, which will be leading the big wing at the end of the show today. The chief pilot of the aircraft restoration company, John Gowdy, finishing off our Battle of Britain film scenario. The Lockheed Martin F-35B Lightning. This is, of course, the so-called STOVL, short takeoff and vertical landing version of the F-35, which is also produced in the A model, the conventional takeoff and landing aircraft. That's the one that, for example, operates from RAF Lakenheath with the US Air Force's 48th Fighter Wing. And there's the US Navy's C model, the carrier variant. It was back in 2015 that the intention to buy 138 Lightnings for use by both the RAF and the Royal Navy was confirmed, with their main operating base to be at Marham. We see the aircraft now coming back in towards display centre, pitching into a turn. Yes, as I was saying, we saw the under fuselage weapons bay doors open there, but we're shortly to see a demonstration of what's really at the heart of the B model Lightning. which is the Rolls-Royce lift system. Fully 29,000 shaft horsepower are transferred from the main Pratt & Whitney F135 engine to the lift fan via a drive shaft and a clutch, and a thrust vectoring nozzle at the rear moves to provide propulsion for forward lift or flight, while the lift fan, which is just after the cockpit section, is used in vertical flight. And each wing contains a roll post nozzle for roll control and to maintain lateral stability using bypass air from the engine. The aircraft in an extremely slow high alpha, high angle attack pass here. Now, while the F-35 can't land here at Duxford, it is able to perform a low, slow approach. Were the aircraft able to touch down, what we'd see would be a rolling vertical landing, and that's the sort of landing that the aircraft would use at, say, an expeditionary site in the field, or flying from a short or damaged runway, where minimising the stopping distance is the priority, and the stopping distance can be as short as just 1,200 feet. It was number 617 Squadron, the famous Dam Busters, of course, which became the first frontline F-35B unit, and its first 4 aircraft arrived at Marham in June 2018. Number 207 Squadron, which acts as the operational conversion unit for the Lightning, followed in July 2019, and the latest operational squadron on type is the first Royal Navy Squadron, 809 Naval Air Squadron, which reformed in December of last year. Squadrons are joint RAF Royal Navy in nature, and the commanding officer and the senior pilot alternate between the services. And earlier this year there was something of a milestone when the first mission was flown assigned to the RAF. The F-35B, as far as its carrier operations with the Royal Navy are concerned, began trials aboard HMS Queen Elizabeth in 2018 and 19, and operational aircraft from number 617 Squadron worked from the ship for the first time in June 2020, making their first carrier strike group deployment with the new carrier the following year. But now this is where it starts to get very noisy indeed, as the F-35B is brought into the hover. intended British fleet of F-35s has been scaled back a bit from those initial intentions to buy to 138 of them. Full operational capability is due in 2025 when the 48th aircraft will be delivered, although further procurements are possible. This is of course an aircraft whose capabilities are evolving all the time. They've been flying long-range missions as part of the response to the conflict in Ukraine, and number 617 Squadron deployed aircraft on the Icelandic air policing mission for NATO earlier this year for the first time. Two Lysanders and the Gladiator. The Mark I Gladiator. There were in fact more Blenheims in RAF service, nearly 1,100 of them, when war broke out against Germany on the 3rd of September 1939 than any other single aircraft type. And that of course was across various roles, because although it had originally been conceived in its military form for the RAF as a light bomber, Daily Mail, potential was seen in the Blenheim as being a long-range fighter, and it's in that configuration that this aircraft appears in. It's a short-nosed Blenheim 1F, F for fighter, with a ventral gun pack containing 4.303-inch Browning machine guns. Was, of course, famously Blenheims that took part in some of the RAF's earliest actions of World War II. It was a Blenheim of number 139 Squadron from Witten, not far from here, close to Huntingdon, which was the first aircraft to overfly Germany following the start of the war. And the following day, the 4th of September 1939, Blenheims of numbers 107 and 110 squadrons flying from Wattisham in Suffolk carried out the first raid of hostilities by RAF Bomber Command, attacking the German fleet in port at Wilhelmshaven and suffering serious losses in the process. Heroically, both by day and, when the type started being used in the night fighter role, by night. Blenheim 1Fs like this were briefly based here at Duxford in the early part of World War II with number 222 Squadron, which was reformed here in October 1939 and flew patrols to protect Channel shipping. It converted to Spitfires in the spring of 1940. It was an aircraft, as for the Gladiator, somewhat out of time. The first RAF fighter to be coming into service with an enclosed cockpit, but also its last new biplane fighter. And here come the two Lysanders, in from the right. With the Royal Navy's Halfar fighter flight of Sea Gladiators. Or perhaps the exploits of RAF and Norwegian Army Air Service Gladiators during the Norwegian campaign in 1940, but they were active during the Battle of Britain as well. Number 247 Squadron flew them from Roborough to defend southwest of the UK, and in particular the naval dockyards at Plymouth. 804 Squadron, the Fleet Air Arm, flew Sea Gladiators from Hatston in Orkney throughout the Battle of Britain, were flown by unofficial of station defence flights at various RAF airfields around the country. But taking centre stage now, the two Lysanders, designed as the first monoplane to equip Army Cooperation Command. The RAF, the then provisional Air Sea Rescue Service, searching for downed RAF airmen in the Channel in order for rescue launchers or other craft to hopefully pick up. It didn't prove especially successful. Also during 1940, Lysanders were carrying out many, frankly rather boring for their crews, patrols of the potential invasion areas along the south coast of England. One of the pilots who was involved in those flights was one future wing commander, Ken Wallace, well known for his autogyro exploits later in life. He was on number 268 Squadron on Lysanders, stationed at Westley. I talked to him about this a few years before he died, and Ken said the only job we were doing was taking off before dawn, flying round the coast over the sea. We were going to see the invasion on its way before they could pick it up with the ground radar. It was a little later in the war that the Lysander saw its most famous employment, which was, of course, with numbers 138 and 161. Those aircraft were fitted with a The others, like the Shuttleworth Collection one leading it, that are still flying today, are all Canadian-built examples, and they're coming in for their last pass now. From the Aircraft Restoration Company, the world's only airworthy example, which was flown by the ARC's Managing Director, John Romain, and the Gladiator from the Shuttleworth Collection in the hands of the Shuttleworth Chief Engineer, Jean-Michel Munn, and hopefully we'll be able to get the Fighter Collection example into the air with them tomorrow. And in now come the two Lysanders, the Shuttleworth one leading, with Willie Hackett at the helm. And then comes the Aircraft Restoration Company example. Which was flown by Dave Ratcliffe. That was our Bristol Mercury engined formation, one of those real only at Duxford moments. But now we turn to by day, Lancasters somewhat lower at night. These two aircraft, beloved parts of our flying heritage. And they seem to inspire an ever greater place in our affections as the years go on. And well they might, when you consider what it takes to keep both of these aircraft in the air, but particularly the aircraft that leads the flypasts we're about to see. Because keeping a four-engined heavy bomber in the air as a privately So look out to the right-hand end of the airfield over the American Air Museum, the stirring sight of Boeing B-17G Flying Fortress Sally B and the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight Avro Lancaster. And there's the bomber brake. What a sound as well. This B-17 was built in 1945 by the Lockheed Vega plant at Burbank, California, and it was delivered to the US Army Air Forces in June that year. They used it, they and the subsequent US Air Force, when it became an independent service, as a trainer and test aircraft until 1954, when it was sold to France's Institut Géographique National as a long-range mapping and survey platform. Based here, and it's stayed in operation of B-17 preservation ever since. Very sadly, the early mastermind behind the aircraft's acquisition and operation, Ted White, was to lose his life in an aircraft accident in the early 1980s. But Ellie Salingbo took up the cudgels and has operated the aircraft ever since. And it operates very specifically as a flying memorial to all the US airmen who were killed in the European theatre between 1942 and 45. The 8th Air Force flying B-17s and B-24s indeed from bases in East Anglia suffered almost half of the US Army Air Force's casualties of the entire war. While the survivability of the 8th Air Force's heavy bomber operations was improved significantly when the long-range escort fighters, like the P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs we're going to see later in the show, came along, also operated by 8th Air Force units, conditions for B-17 and B-24 crews were still exceptionally tough. And why this aircraft needs to be kept flying for future generations. And the final pass coming up is always performed with smoke on to simulate 2 damaged engines. And apart from the bomber crews of the 8th Air Force, it also commemorates the members and thanks the members of the Sally B Supporters Club, whose memberships, devotion and backing help keep this aircraft flying. In these parts during the latter part of the Second World War, when hundreds of these aircraft operated from bases across East Anglia, crisscrossing the skies in enormous formations. But thanks to this aeroplane, Sally B, we're provided with something of a reflection on that period of World War II in the European theatre. What a lovely formation, and what a lovely solo display That was Sally B then, the B-17G Flying Fortress, into land in the hands of Captain Peter Kuipers and First Officer and Chief Engineer Darrell Taplin. Don't forget, incidentally, the Sally...
left, right? If that's your vehicle, then please do go and remove it from where it's parked at the moment, where it's been left with the engine on.
But now, in for its solo display.
Okay.
the Consolidated PBY-5A Catalina of plain sailing.
Radar particularly was so effective.
Underneath, taking off the Grumman FM2 Wildcat. Representing here in particular recording, it's used by the Fleet Air Arm of the Royal Navy as the Marklet, and off after it goes a rather earlier Fleet Air Arm fighter, the Hawk and Nimrod 1. And the final aircraft in this little combine, the Fairey Swordfish 1.
Fantastic, what a trio.
The Typhoon in service with the RAF with squadrons based in Northern Ireland during 1941, and it was that May that they had their first major success with RAF Coastal Command as part of the hunt for the German battleship Bismarck.
You can see on the fuselage these large spherical windows. They're actually oversized.
They were. The Catalina was on the 7th of May 1945, just the day before VE Day. So the wingtip floats have come down here.
The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest battle of the Second World War, in fact. The U-boats were operating throughout, and it was only at the very end when the Kriegsmarine actually gave up. This aircraft, of course, was used widely for air-sea rescue, and in fact this carries the artwork for Miss Pickup, the original Miss Pickup, based out of Halesworth in Suffolk.
Yes, finally, pretty close to the end of the war, the US Army Air Forces in Britain got their hands on a few Catalinas, which they called OA-10As, and used them for air-sea rescue purposes with the 8th Air Force, and the aircraft becoming part of the group was named. You don't have to be a pilot, you just have to have an enthusiasm for the Catalina.
And a fairly large wallet.
Yes, indeed. Then it's a very good opportunity. The aircraft now with the tricycle undercarriage down, on final approach. It's had a very busy year, including a trip up to the north of Scotland to commemorate the oldest surviving Victoria Cross recipient, Flying Officer John Cruikshank, Catalina captain with number 210 Squadron of RAF Coastal Command, now aged 103, and the aircraft was able to overfly his home. Flying the Catalina for us today, in the captain's seat Phil Pettit, and in the co-pilot seat Jeff Boyling. A rather appropriate stablemate in this slot now in the overhead. The Fairey Swordfish aircraft that really was obsolete by the time World War II broke out. This torpedo spotter reconnaissance biplane with a 750 horsepower Bristol Pegasus radial engine. Demonstrated during this display. 13 squadrons of Swordfish were operational within the Fleet Air Arm on the outbreak of war. Really, the Royal Navy should never have gone to war with such an outdated aeroplane as this in a leading role. It illustrates some of the complacency that had gone on during the 1930s when it came to military procurement and future threats.
But its manoeuvrability and its slowness actually made it quite difficult to shoot down.
Yeah, this is an aircraft that has a cruise speed of just 90 knots, 104 miles an hour, if it's lightly laden. That goes down to 82 knots, or 94 miles an hour, with the torpedo underslung. But the issue was, and this came to pass during the attacks on the Bismarck, was that the Swordfish flew so slowly that the Bismarck's flak guns found it difficult to track them. And they also struggled with close-in targets, as the Swordfish were. It was a bit of a surprising drawback, I think, in terms of the equipment on the Bismarck, and it was rectified later on ships like the Tirpitz. Crucially also, Swordfish crews were very well trained in torpedo delivery. They practiced for this endlessly, as well as, of course, the aircraft being very stable and controllable in all weathers and at night.
One of the most well-known operations of the Swordfish was, of course, the attack on the Italian fleet in Taranto.
Yes.
And the success of that operation, as I was saying, was the inspiration for the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Lots of those battleships were actually sunk by a torpedo.
The aircraft HMS Victorious achieved one torpedo strike and slowed the ship down. That allowed HMS Ark Royal to get into range, and 3 squadrons of Swordfish from Ark Royal then achieved 3 hits. One of them damaged the Bismarck's rudder, basically stopped it from manoeuvring and allowed the home fleet to sink it. Most of them, guns, including this one, were built not by Fairey, its original designer and manufacturer, but by Blackburn, and they were still active in anti-shipping efforts in Norway as late as January 1945. But in comes the Fighter Collection's Wildcat. This Swordfish has had invasion stripes applied to it by the Navy Wing's Heritage Flight this year to commemorate the role of the Fleet Air Arm on D-Day in 1944, operations in which Swordfish themselves were used, laying smoke screens to protect Channel convoys and flying anti-E-boat and U-boat patrols. And it's been wonderful to see this aircraft performing so regularly and so well on the circuit this year in the hands of Navy Wings, and the crew today for a lovely display headed by the front line with British forces during the battle in 1940. At that stage, the Wildcat was known to the Fleet Air Arm of the Royal Navy as the Marklet, and 804 Squadron was based in the Orkney Islands with Gladiators when in October 1940, just a few weeks before the end of the Battle of Britain, they took delivery of these stubby little American carrier-borne fighters. Their role was to protect the fleet anchorage at Scapa Flow. It was only after the end of the Battle of Britain, in fact on Christmas Day 1940, when the type scored its first aerial victory, and it was a Fleet Air Arm Marklet that shot down a Junkers Ju-88 over Scapa Flow. The following year, these aircraft began to take a very active part in the Battle of the Atlantic, taking on the much-feared Luftwaffe Focke-Wulf Condor maritime strike aircraft while flying from the Royal Navy's escort carriers. Of course, it had been developed originally in the 1930s war, although only one carrier-borne US Navy unit was fully equipped with them at the time of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The Hawker Hurricane to the last airstrike of World War II in Europe on the 5th of May 1945 against the U-boat depot near Harstad in Norway. But now we turn the clock back to the Fleet Air Arm of the 1930s and also from the fighter collection, the Hawker Nimrod 1. Came up with a private bench aeroplane which has sometimes been called the Norn or the Sea Hornet, but later became the Nimrod. Installed in the wings and fuselage. Just 92 of them went on to be built. 42 of those were Mark 1s like this. to fleet fighter flight aboard HMS Courageous in November 1931. Those aircraft pretty soon were en route aboard the ship to the Mediterranean. There they transferred to HMS Glorious, and Nimrods were deployed quite widely aboard the Royal Navy's aircraft carriers, including HMS Glorious deploying in 1935 to the eastern Mediterranean in the wake of the invasion by Mussolini's Italy of what was then Abyssinia. And gently floating down onto the grass comes the Hawker Nimrod, which had steel
Oh, here they
come. In from the right, the 4 Hawker Hurricanes.
As he pulls up, he converts his speed into height to perform his first manoeuvre, the hammerhead. Flight Lieutenant Hughes was born in Carmarthen, South Wales, and started his flying career in the Royal Air Force in 1989, flying the VC-10 out of RAF Bryce Norton, and then as a search and rescue for the inverted pass. This is Bob's first year with the tutor display, and he's operating at a base height of 500 feet, except the two final passes at 300 feet. The next two manoeuvres are the wing over and the ballistic roll, which Bob can use to gain energy for the next part of the sequence. The ballistic rolls are flown towards you in an off-crowd wind and away from you in an on-crowd wind. When not displaying, Bob is a qualified flying instructor on 115 Squadron based at RAF Wittering, where he trains the future generation of Royal Air Force pilots, as well as converting frontlines ready for some great angles. Throughout the slow roll, Bob will skillfully coordinate elevator, rudder and aileron inputs to keep the lift vector pointing upwards. This prevents him from descending towards the ground. The tutor has a top speed of 212 miles per hour, which is 185 knots, and can achieve maximum positive 6G, meaning that the pilot is subjected to forces 6 times stronger than gravity. Next we have another wing over, a combined pitching and rolling manoeuvre, used to turn the flight path through 180 degrees. You'll notice that every wing over is slightly different, as Bob carefully selects his flight path to cater for differing wind conditions and aircraft energy states. Bob now rolls 90 degrees while pointing straight up, before completing a stall turn at almost zero airspeed. The two 90-degree turns allow Bob to continue in the same direction. The tutor is operated by Number 6 Flying Training School in partnership with Bandrock International Group, primarily flying University Air Squadron students and RAF Air Cadets. There are 13 air experience flights across the UK that offer flights in the opposite direction to the entry. In the next manoeuvre, the 4-point roll, Bob delicately uses the rudder to support the nose above the horizon while flying at 90 degrees angular bank. You may have noticed the heart on the belly of the aircraft. This is from the Royal Air Force Benevolent Fund, seen since 2022 to celebrate this fantastic charity. The Benevolent Fund supports Royal Air Force
and the P-47D, named Nellie B, following behind, both owned by Fighter Aviation Engineering. The Bearcat, the third aircraft. Took over entirely. than 60 miles an hour. After World War II, the of 1950 to 53 by both the Royal Navy and war, shot down a MiG-15. The western end of the airfield is the Bearcat. US Navy Bearcats aboard the carrier USS Boxer were sent to defend what was then the Republic of China, now Taiwan, against communist Chinese threats. The French Air Force used them in the Indochina conflict of the 1950s. Just watch this one now performing a 16-point hesitation roll. Because the P-47 equipped the 78th Fighter Group of the US 8th Air Force here from 1943 until towards the end of 1944, when conversion to the P-51 Mustang that we'll be seeing later began. P-47s of the US 8th and 9th Air Forces were very active over occupied Europe, attacking Luftwaffe airfields and softening up the German air arm in advance of the Allied invasion of Europe. Having mentioned piston versus jet combat, it's worth recalling that it was 80 years ago, just a few weeks back, on the 28th of August 1944, that a 78th Fighter Group Duxford-based P-47 pilot, Major Joseph Myers, was leading a flight of P-47s. For very many years, when it was owned by the Fighter Collection, in 2018 it came back in the ownership of Fighter Aviation Engineering, coming in now for its last pass. P-47 named Nellie B, operated by the 48th Fighter Group's 492nd Fighter Squadron from Ibsley in the New Forest around the D-Day period. The 48th Fighter Group as well, and as I say, this aircraft painted in the colours of one of the other squadrons of that group.
That's right, yep. So
both the Fury and the Bearcat back on the ground. The Fury was flown by Paul Bonham. Then we've got the Bearcat taxiing past in the hands of Pete Kinsey, chief pilot of the fighter collection. And then that sight seen so many times in wartime, P-47 in over the threshold at Duxford. Mark Levy touching down with that. But now it is one of the Swedish Air Force's historic flight, the Saab B17A. Was being built up at that time, but Sweden lacked its own aircraft manufacturing capabilities. One of the then Swedish companies, called AFF, put forward a design for a reconnaissance aircraft that was never built. Another company, Asia, developed its own, which became a Saab product when it merged with Saab. And there's quite a lot of American influence in this design as well. It's fully aerobatic. That American influence was because American engineers were working for Asia to support licensed production of the Northrop 8A1 attack bomber and the North American NA-16 trainer, though most of them left Sweden when war broke out. This design for a reconnaissance aircraft, and he made a safe landing at Linköping, the Saab factory airfield, even though he had blood streaming down his face. A bomb-tossing device which made it unnecessary to put the aeroplane into a vertical dive. And pilots found that the B-17, the bomber version, rarely reached the speed at which the dive brakes were needed. Run came to 325, and they equipped 6 wings of the Swedish Air Force. They had quite a lot of different engines. This one here has a Pratt they replaced. STWC. Perhaps not surprisingly, because they were things such as the Hawker Hart biplane. The first of them, S-17BLs, for the Finnish Air Force had small numbers. This is the last flying example in the world. It was used as a target tug by the civilian company Avia in Sweden. It dates from 1943 and had served with F-7 wing of the Swedish Air Force before that. It was much later donated to the Swedish Air Force Museum and kept in storage. Then there came the idea of putting it back into flying condition. Saab assisted in that. It took to the air again in June 1997. And we saw it here at Duxford for the 2005 Flying Legends show, its only previous appearance here. Now, though, Since last December, it's been in the hands of the Swedish Air Force Historic Flight, which has a tremendous collection of historic Saab aeroplanes, mostly jets, as far as the Saab machines are concerned, to its name, and it's thanks to that organisation that we see it here this weekend. And there you can get a great look at those enormous undercarriage fairings come dive brakes. The Saab B17A of the Swedish Air Force Historic Flight, an excellent routine from its pilot, Olle Norén. Start of the show, we're about to see the other prime element of the RAF's front line. Stationed at Coningsby, and here it comes, in from the right, the Eurofighter Typhoon FGR-4. Very definite local connection. He grew up in Cambridgeshire, and when he was 17 years old, he came to Duxford and took a Tiger Moth flight with classic wings, and that got him hooked on flying. Flying the specially painted display jet for this year, which commemorates the D-Day 80th anniversary. The aircraft painted up as its namesake from the Second World War, an example of the Hawker Typhoon that served with number 257 Squadron during the Battle of Normandy. 11 and 12 squadrons, plus number 41 Squadron, which is the Test and Evaluation Squadron. Up at Lossiemouth on the Moray Firth, meanwhile, the numbers 1, 2, 6 and 9 squadrons. Of number 1435 flight that provide the air defence of the Falkland Islands, one of the many overseas commitments held by the RAF's Typhoon force in recent years. Coming past us for a very nicely executed slow roll. The burners once again on the two Eurojet EJ200 turbofan engines, 20,000 pounds of thrust with afterburner, giving this aircraft a top speed of around twice the speed of sound. A very high angle of attack, very nose high barrel roll there, as Turbo then positions the aircraft in for the slow pass, coming towards us at just 110 knots, and of course here making full use of the aircraft's digital fly-by-wire system, You can see there the small canard foreplanes on the forward fuselage, which assist in giving the pilot pitch control. Showing you the upper surfaces now on a topside pass, but there with an uncomfortable negative and continuing partially in the inverted into a negative half Cuban manoeuvre. Typhoon stationed at both Collarsby and Lossiemouth, very much the successors to the RAF's Fighter Command forebears from 1940. They mount the 24/7, 365-day-a-year QRA, Quick Reaction Alert, air defence facility from both bases, but these aircraft have been very heavily committed also on air-to-ground operations around the world in recent years. Coming in to complete his display with a hopefully spectacular departure, Flight Lieutenant David Turnbull with the RAF Eurofighter Typhoon FGR-4. We're in a pretty congested area of airspace here at Duxford, which prevented the full vertical show from being flown. We still got to demonstrate